Fantastic. Well, I'm delighted to introduce you to Robert Newry. Robert is the CEO and co-founder of Arctic Shores, the leading behavioural-based assessment provider that combines neuroscience, psychometrics and game technology to help organisations to make better hiring decisions. Robert is perhaps not your typical ABP speaker in that he doesn't have a traditional training in psychology or HR, but he does have a huge amount of experience applying technology to our HR challenges. Today, Robert will interject some fresh ideas through the use of technology to spark the debate about what could happen in business psychology over the next 20 years. To take part in the debate, please post your questions in the chat function and we'll answer them at the end. But before I hand over to Robert, I just want to say a special thanks to our gold sponsors, Lumina Learning, Adapter Solutions and Comms Multilingual. And if you want to find out more about them, please check out the ABP website or join their workshops this week. And now Robert will share his insights in a session that is being recorded. So if you miss anything, you can watch the recording back this evening at 6 to 7.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Diana. And really delighted to have this opportunity to speak to all the ABP members, and thank you very much for inviting me. Let me just bring up my presentation. Right, so it seems quite appropriate that I should be delivering my talk through technology to everyone, slightly strange though it seems. But the title of my presentation is being quite carefully thought through. So this concept of a technospective. It's not something that you will see in the English dictionary, but it encapsulates for me two themes for my presentation today. The first comes from an agile software term called a retrospective, which is really looking back at what we've learnt and how can we improve going forward on that. And then the second part, the techno piece, is how I want to turn the table and share with all of you today how technologists see psychology. And from that perspective, highlight some of the risks that I see to business psychology and its long-term influence on predicting human behavior in the workplace, if, as a profession, it doesn't start building a deep technological framework into its approach and application. So let's start with just the first time that I presented to the ABP, which was back in 2015. The heady days of when Arctic Shores was excited about gamification and bringing a totally new approach to assessment, and there literally was just 8 of us. And in case you don't recognize the cartoon characterization from the Zoom image here, I've highlighted myself, but that was the very first time actually that we brought the idea of a new form of assessment to the ABP. And since that time, 6 years on, we've now had more than 1 million completed assessments. Our assessment's been translated in 24 languages. We're in 3 locations in terms of offices, been used in more than 60 countries. We now have 70 staff speaking 12 different languages. So it's been an incredibly exciting journey and every bit as much of fulfilling the dreams as we first had when we first spoke to you. But the purpose around Arctic Shores was never really around games. It was always about, for Saif and I, who founded the business, the determining potential. How do we understand somebody's potential to do a job? And that is why we see ourselves now as a talent discovery platform that sees more in people. And I think in the current economic climate, identifying potential, seeing more in people is more important than ever. But let's go back to my retrospective now. And before starting the retrospective, I thought it would be good just to look again at what is business psychology all about. So I took this from the ABP website and edited it down a little bit. And I just want to highlight some of the words in there. So, we're about the science of understanding human behavior, how you interlock that with experience of the world of work, and then link that further to performance. So if you look at it in that way, you can then trace it, and this is what a technologist would do, into three things. What's the input? How do we collect that information about the way that people behave? How do we turn that into a model from which we can then predict behavior, either generally or in the workplace? I'm going to use this précis version of how a technologist would look at business psychology through this presentation as a way of being able to think about the model and approach and the differences between business psychology and how it goes about its work and how technology approaches it. The big question then, if you trace it down into that way for the 21st century, is who or what is better at predicting human behavior, whether in the general life or in the workplace? Is it a computer? Is it a human? And when we talk about a human, who are we talking about here? Is it a neuroscientist? Is it a psychologist? Or is it a data scientist? Or perhaps is there a combination of the two that would be better at predicting workplace behaviors? So this is the question that I want us to think about as we go through the presentation today. And how I'm going to answer it is take this, first of all, perspective from a psychologist and how I see that psychologists look at the world of technology, and then flip it on its head again, take a technologist's perspective of psychology. And then lastly, I'll share some thoughts of how I think from the learnings in this retrospective approach that the ABP and business psychologists generally can think about how they change the way that they do things and make it a little bit more tech-driven. So if we come back to this point again about input, model, and prediction. Now, from a psychologist's perspective, input is really about self-report. That's how we've always approached things. That's what we feel comfortable with. We model it based on the Big Five personality framework, typically taking 50 to 100 data inputs to come up with that model. And then we use that model to make predictions in the workplace, typically using our favorite statistical tool, SPSS. And very much, if you think of that as a statistical tool, it's a sort of Marmite view of it. If you either love it or hate it, but it is something that we're comfortable with. And I think the interesting thing is that it hasn't really changed in the way that we do this over the last 20 years. As a result, I think the way that psychologists have looked at the technology timeline over the last 20 years is more about how technology has either replicated things that we've been doing as psychologists, or it's automated things. So the first element to all of this was back in 2000 when the ABP started moving from paper to online, and that was the big technological innovation and revolution at the time. Then it was about how do we automate item generation, computer adaptive testing. But it wasn't really looking at how technology was changing anything in the way that we conduct business psychology. And then we had the arrival of the smartphone, and and if we take a sort of retrospective on that, I think when I first came into the sector, all the discussion around smartphones was how do we squash the big screen that we've been delivering our assessments through the computer screen into a small screen. It was about being mobile ready. It was never really about mobile native or what additional challenges and benefits that a mobile device brought into the way that we could understand and interpret human behavior. And as a result, really, the evolution since then has been to look at technology, and certainly in the way that we gather inputs for our modelling, as more just an enhanced way of collecting information, but not really changing the way that we think about our approach. And then you have this whole parallel world of neuroscience, and it fascinated me as an external person coming in that that my understanding of psychology was really a framework that enabled us to interpret the electrical and chemical activities that are going on in a brain. Personality doesn't exist outside of the electrical and chemical activities that are going on in our brains. And yet the world of psychology seemed to be seen completely separate from neuroscience. Never the two shall meet. I found very little in terms of studies where psychologists and neuroscientists had come together. And yet there's these huge advances in the last 20 years with MRI scanners, with EEG headsets now helping us understand how the brain works and the way that can project itself in terms of behavior. And I think part of the problem around this is that we have an academic view and we have a practical view. And even within the world of neuroscience, they have this challenge, but I think it is endemic, this problem between academia and the practical world. So if you look at Elon Musk released recently an update from his company Neuralink, where they've made some major advances in inserting probes into Gertrude, the pig's brain, and from that really getting some detailed and accurate inputs from how Gertrude was able to sniff, able to make decisions and choices, and how it was picking up from the electrodes that were inserted. But the academic view of that was, I don't think there's anything revolutionary in the presentation. And this becomes part of the challenge, I think, for not just neuroscience, but psychology as well. That this image that, oh, have we got to learn something new, and not really understanding actually where the innovation is coming from. The innovation is coming from the input, the way of measuring, the way that Neuralink has shrunk down these electrodes to understand how the brain works. And, you know, I think Elon Musk's response to that sort of academic view is really interesting. Which is a lot of the innovation comes about not necessarily that we've learned something new about how the brain works, but we've learned, we've got a new way of being able to get that information faster, smaller, more accurately. And therefore what will be the change and learnings that will be accelerated from some of these technology innovations that are coming about. And then we have this whole world of artificial intelligence, and the emphasis, it seems, in the world of psychology, but also generally, has been on artificial rather than in intelligence. And so there's a skepticism about what AI can bring to our world. And I think the A-level disaster that we had this summer is a great example of this. And I know that the Prime Minister would never pretend to be a business psychologist or a statistician in any way, and his words clearly demonstrate that. But this concept of that an algorithm can be a mutant is extraordinary, and it highlights this suspicion of something that is therefore artificial. Do we understand it? Is it something therefore that is alien to us and therefore to be feared? But the algorithm did what it was asked to do. There was nothing wrong with the algorithm. What was wrong was the way that it was applied. And so the issue here is not that technology is the problem. The issue is we don't make an effort to understand what technology can and should be doing. And so that is our problem, not technology's problem. So now let's, now that we've understood how we've looked at the world from a psychologist, what's been happening in the world of technology, and how has that been using psychology, and is there anything that we can learn from that? So let's come back to this concept again of input, model, and prediction. And if you're a technologist, you have none of the training, none of the historical assumptions that there is only one way to get input about human behavior. There's only one way to model it, and there's only one application from which you might generate a prediction. For them, it's completely fresh. So the first thing a technologist would do, and has done, is look at where are the challenges around getting accurate pictures of human behavior. So they would look at asking people questions. What are some of the challenges around that? Does that always give you an accurate picture of somebody's personality? And it's not to say that self-report is bad in any way, but can technology improve some of the contexts where self-report really isn't working? And in high-stakes situations, recruitment's a clear example of where asking somebody a question about themselves, and you can see from the questions here, which are regularly talked about, may not give us the most accurate picture of that person's true behavioural preferences, and therefore provide issues with our model of how they might then perform in the workplace. So technology, which is, well, hang on, can we bypass all of this, and can we just look at what people do and how they behave, and get our understanding of personality from that? So let's just look at tapping buttons and see from the way that people respond to things, can we get a better picture? And so that is what the various parts of the technology world have started looking at. Can we take tasks, way people press buttons, turn that into, or use our understanding of individual differences, collect data, create a behavioral based model that we can then create a fit profile, whatever that fit profile might be, so that we can predict behavioral outcomes. And that's exactly what they have set out to do and have been doing for the last 15, 20 years. You have this sort of world of digital psychometrics that's grown up by looking at where can we capture people's behavioral responses from the way that they tap buttons. And of course, there is an incredibly rich set of data from the way that people perform and interact with the world that you can collect from different sources, whether it be from web browsers or social media. And that's why we now have this capability to create a digital prediction based on a digital footprint. So things like browsing history, Facebook likes, Instagram shares, all of these are about pressing buttons, but ultimately, if you understand the context of when and how they're pressing the buttons, it enables you to get a picture of that person's preferences. They've then modeled it using the Big Five personality framework, and from that, they've been able to make some incredibly accurate predictions around things like life satisfaction, religion, political preference. All of this has come from a mixture of a different form of digital input, combining it with a personality framework. And this has happened. This has been going on. You know, Google, Facebook, Uber, all of these people and these organizations have been doing this. And it's taken time really for academia to catch up. And it was 2015 that this incredible study from Wu, Kaczynski and Stilwell came out, where they looked at Facebook likes and showed an extraordinary difference in terms of how new forms of input, creating a model of personality that took these new forms of data input, took what we know about personality, and then starting to predict people's preferences in the world. And what you can see from this, which I think is really fascinating, is you know, a computer's average accuracy of somebody's personality preference was as close to a spouse, as close to somebody who's living day in, day out with an individual, and so much higher than a work colleague. So you have now got academia that is sort of catching up with what has already been happening in the world of technology to predict behavior. And the scary thing is that Facebook and Google have worked this out a long time ago. I mean, we don't even think about, when we type in now words into Google, that it is already anticipating what the rest of the sentence is going to be, and how scarily accurate that is. But that's not happened by chance. It's happened by a lot of work in the background. And of course, they're monetizing it now. And what the monetizing means is that they clearly have been successful in predicting behavior, because if they weren't successful in doing that, then they wouldn't be able to successfully monetize it in the way that they have. The other part of the world that's also been very carefully looking at how to understand behaviors and measure them is the video game world. It's a $160 billion industry now, and that is all about getting engagement, understanding why and how people interact with the scenarios and the simulations that they present in their video games. So they've been looking not just in the analytics side, but also looking at the input side. So moving on not just from tapping buttons, but the video games industry has really been driving the take-up of things like virtual reality, augmented reality, and what will be coming out in the next 5 years or so is a sort of mixed reality framework, where you impose an image on top of what you actually see. And I think one of the interesting things around technology is that we always over-predict the impact it's going to have when it first comes out, but we under-predict the long-term change it's going to make in the way that society operates. And I think that's going to be as true for business psychology as it is in other areas of the world. And just in case you don't think this is really impacting business psychology, this is an example from McGraw-Hill, where they are teaching psychology now using gamification and using simulations. This is their 2019 an example quest of their actual coursework for teaching psychology. So there's a whole new generation of psychologists that will be coming into our profession that look at technology in a different way, and how are we preparing for that. And I suppose we come to a crossroads now at this particular point of time, where is data science and a computer algorithm better at predicting human behavior than a psychologist? And that becomes a really important question, because if we don't see and understand some of the changes that data science and the way that technology companies are predicting human behavior, we don't embrace that as psychologists, and especially as business psychologists, we're in danger of just being entirely left behind. And that has significance, I think, for for some really important ways that technology is then used in the workplace. And for me, I think we have to, how do we get the people element back into the equation of predicting human behavior? So I think it starts with, the world of psychology and neuroscience embracing technology and data science and building it into the way that we conduct our work and the way that we apply our knowledge. And that we need to think now really of a world of people science. It can't just be business psychology separate from technology. I think we have to look at that there are things that are going on that we can learn around from data science and bring it into the way that we conduct our work. And that's important because of the many things that we've seen in the last few years, that if data science runs away in terms of predicting human behavior and doesn't have the knowledge and expertise that I think business psychology can bring to that world, you have this black box problem where we could end up making predictions that have adverse impact on certain parts of society because it is a black box. And so rather than sort of saying, well, everything around data science and AI is dangerous, I think actually we should be embracing it and saying, well, how do we understand it? How do we encourage the transparency? How do we set standards for the use of technology such that we end up with a predictive model that doesn't have adverse impact and create more challenges than it solves? So with that kind of understanding, and I think having taken those retrospectives, here is my thoughts of how I think the ABP and generally business psychologists might take a bit more of a tech-driven approach to the way they do things. The first starting point is to open our minds and actually really understand and embrace what technology brings to psychology, rather than this sort of skeptical, can we challenge it? And I think it's right to say that that any new technology has to be able to prove its validity, check that its adverse impact and impact on applicants generally has been thought through. But rather than just saying our clients, the people ultimately that we're working with and supporting as business psychologists, are just blind to this, so be careful. What we should be doing is providing advice and showing that we have subject matter expertise in the way that technology can be applied to business psychology and workplace performance, rather than just saying, be distrustful of it, don't take it on board until you have seen all the way that technology has met our standards, rather than bringing ourselves into the world of technology and helping the HR community better understand what technology can do to enhance their world, which is why they're looking at it in the first place. And I think one of the things around this is to do with criterion validity. I remember when Ben Williams first was talking to Saif and me, and we founded Arctic Shores. He took Saif and I through, this is if you want your assessment, you want to bring the technology innovation that you want into the world of recruitment and assessment, you have to get the gold standard is criterion validity, which I get. But in the world of GDPR, it's incredibly hard to get this performance data. And then the other thing that we found as we went into trying to get this sort of gold standard and prove what already Facebook and Google already knew, that through touching buttons you can get a good insight into human behavior, was that the performance data that we got from companies was often inadequate as well. So we set this requirement of new technology that you've got to hit this gold standard. And if you don't hit this gold standard, then we're going to remain skeptical, without actually saying, well, is it because the technology companies aren't respectful of the standards, or actually it's just really hard to get to the data points that we've set to hit this gold standard? And are we doing anything to help around this as a profession, as a society, and as an association? Or actually, are we just putting off technology companies and just saying, you know, we're making it really, really hard for you to get to this, and so they just run off and do their own thing anyway? And I think that's you know, one of the things that we've got to look at is, are we setting up technology companies for success and embracing this? Or actually has the world changed and it's much harder for them to meet the standards? Not that they shouldn't be, we shouldn't be trying to support them rather than just making it an impossible hurdle. So I think the way that we look at best practice is really important, and these things remain key foundation stones for anybody bringing a new technology to predicting human behavior and how that might be applied in the workplace. But there have to be other things as well, other things that we have to understand. Things around, you know, algorithmic adverse impact checks. How do we do that? What is the standard around that? Confidence indicators. How do we bring that? And what do we expect from that? And how can technology support it? What are the algorithmic standards that we expect people who are using algorithms to predict behavior or enhance the way that we as business psychologists understand the science of human behavior and how it's going to change the way that we're able to predict human behavior? You know, that we see discussions now around ethical AI. Well, what does ethical AI mean? Why does, you know, do we have as an association a set of guidelines on that? How are we driving that conversation? And I think just as importantly, you know, what should the tech platform standards be? There are things around refresh rates. There are things around the differences between how inputting from a keyboard as opposed to inputting from a touch screen change the way that we collect data and the input that we gather about people's behaviors that we then turn into a model. How have we understood and thought about that? Do we have standards? Do we challenge companies in the way that they use technology, or try and understand how it might have an impact on the way that we capture information? So the point is that scientific advancement is happening all the time. And I think the challenge for organizations like the ABP is, how many neuroscientists are we bringing into the conversations when we think about the future of business psychology? How many data scientists are we bringing in to our discussions? How many software engineers, people who really understand the technology interface? How many of those are we bringing into our discussions? Because we can't just say that business psychology sits in its own little world. Meanwhile, all this scientific advancement is happening outside, and we need to learn from that rather than push it out of our everyday work. We're clearly aware of it, but are we really embracing it? I think the other thing too is that, you know, we need to change our frame of mind. There's a lot of things that tech can do to support diversity in the workplace. I've seen some amazing charities that have used technology to support people who are challenged by either their means to communicate across the neurodiversity spectrum. There are lots of things that technology can do in a really good way, and how we looking and understanding that and encouraging the use of technology to enhance diversity in the workplace. So some final thoughts as I sort of wrap things up. First of all, I think we need to bring in data scientists and neuroscientists into our discussions around standards. We cannot set standards for how we expect business psychology and the tools that we use to be applied in the workplace if we are not using the broadest spectrum of subject matter experts that are driving the way that human behavior is being understood. Secondly, I think there needs to be much more rapid education, and that's something that we can do ourselves just by listening to podcasts in fields outside business psychology. But also, I think the onus is on the associations as well to think about how do we bring education around technology into the way that we advance the world of business psychology. Third, I think we need to encourage and support. I think this approach of skepticism and keeping back technology until it meets our standards rather than going out and embracing it is just a mindset that I think needs to be really carefully looked at. And then lastly, how do we broaden best practice and our explanation and definition of that into the world of HR that includes a perspective on technology, not just on the business psychology practice bit. The two are intermingled now. It certainly is true from an HR manager. It's much, much harder now in that role than it ever has been to keep on top of technology and how it helps them do their jobs better. And I think that they can turn and should turn to business psychologists for that practical advice. And I think the ABP has always defined itself as being practical about it. And so my last thought is embrace technology, understand it, don't ignore it and just say, oh, I'm aware of it, but I don't want to bring it into my world. And I hope that from the talk that I've given here and this retrospective, that you will come away encouraged to look at this and think about technology for the next 20 years in a very different way than you might have done in the last 20 years. Thank you very much for listening, and I open to any questions now.
Great, thank you very much, Robert. So we have the first question is, let me just get that up for you. Apologies. Okay, so do we need to bring tech more into training?
Yes, and I think one of the interesting things for me is that there are two ways that you might be able to do that. So first is you could bring tech into training just by talking about it and explaining different elements of technology and how they are being used in the world of HR, but also how are we using, like McGraw-Hill, or how are we using technology to enhance education. So gamification has hugely driven the world of e-learning. And if you look in the States around how primary education is now being taught using technology, and particularly in the the pandemic lockdown world we live in now, that's just accelerated massively. So for me, I'd like to see how are we using some of the e-learning uses of technology to make education more engaging, to make it more effective. And I think that is part of how are we encouraging the teaching of psychology to embrace technology, not just in its understanding, but its delivery.
Absolutely. Thank you. So another question, could you explain a little more about enhanced reasonable adjustments?
Yes. So I think one of the things that, when we look at reasonable adjustments, it has been very simple. It's typically, we use reasonable adjustments in an aptitude and cognitive measure, and it tends to be just a time-driven change. So we can add 25% or 20%. Actually, I think if we're really looking at behavior and understanding behavior, there's so much more we could learn, and certainly we've seen it at Arctic Shores about how you can see that people on the neurodiverse spectrum respond to stimuli in different ways. That means that you can adjust the way that you present information in a much richer way than I just give them a bit more time. So I think that's another great example of what can we understand from technology to really look at some of the things that we've not really looked at and just assumed that that's the only way that we can address it.
Great, thank you, Robert. So a question here is, what about people who choose not to interact with technology, particularly on a public platform? It certainly must reflect some aspects of personality, belief and values. However, in your view, to what extent does this present a risk of a limited sample of data science prediction of human behaviour? And how could this be addressed in your view?
Yeah, I mean, you have this debate all the time around, well, some people don't like technology, and therefore we shouldn't force them to have to use technology, and that's absolutely right. I'm not saying that that technology is the only way that you can measure human behavior. The point, though, is that the vast majority of people are using technology, and that's only going to accelerate. And interestingly for me, I often get asked, what about older people? They're less comfortable with technology than perhaps the millennials. And they may be less comfortable in terms of, rapid use of inputs. But the biggest users of tablets, for example, are the over 55 population. So it's not a case that people are necessarily unfamiliar with the use of technology. They might be less familiar, but technology is being used all around how we have to interface with the world. And so the point is not necessarily that forcing technology on everyone, rather that we've got this incredible richness in terms of sample size of being able to measure human behavior, and let's use that. Let's learn from it, and then ultimately we have to give people many methods of providing inputs into whatever model we come up with. But we should at least incorporate technology into it rather than saying that these are two separate fields.
Great. So I guess, so do you have any advice for people, maybe the younger generation or ourselves, when we're thinking about being presented with a technical driven assessment? What's the best way of preparing for them, managing them if they've drawn from our data activity?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point around this. So you've got the point around this is twofold. One, if you're going to introduce technology into your way of measuring people, then there should be a requirement to make it really easy. So there's a user experience, user interface requirement around this, and be interesting as to how you set standards around that for ease of use, and that design piece is really important, because what the interface does is it either makes you feel comfortable with what you're about to do, or it makes you scared, in which case we're not using technology in the right way. I think then the other thing is that so you make it really easy for people to adopt, and that should be part of the remit for the standard for any application. But also you give people the opportunity to practice and get familiar with it, and there are many ways you can do that. You can either do that within the application itself, or provide a separate application that gives people the opportunity to try out a new form of technology in a safe space that they feel comfortable with it before they then use it in a real life example. But it comes back to how do we help and encourage the use of technology and make sure that we're embracing the use of it to support people in there, rather than just saying, oh, hang on, if you're comfortable with it, great, you can use it. And if you're not comfortable with it, don't use it. Because actually, there are many advantages if we look at technology in the right way that it can bring. So the issue should be, how do we make it easy for people to use it? And we should set some standards on that rather than keeping it separate.
Great, thank you. So a question that follows on a little bit. You made the point that that you use a profile of a current employee to design a fit profile. And if so, how does the system know if the people who completed the game assessment are the ideal profile for the success? Isn't it just matching people to people instead of people to a job?
Yeah. So that's a great question, and it comes back to this point about how you design these things. So what is what's the framework that you're going to use? If you're going to use existing employees as your reference point, then what are the criteria that you need to have in place to feel really comfortable with it? So, for example, is it a mixture of high, average, and below average performers? Because it needs to be a mixture. If it's just one group of high performers, then you've got, again, a restriction of range around that. Then you've got the challenge around, well, are we just replicating success of the past, and actually we live in a different world now, so how do you bring in a future set of requirements for the role? And that for me goes back exactly to my point about people science around that. That's where we as business psychologists can provide that subject matter expert on top of the statistical data science approach about it, or that we're about to use. And I think that's the really important bit that we should be thinking about, is how can we use the tremendous subject matter expertise and knowledge that as business psychologists have been built up over 20, 30 plus years, and use that to make data science better, to do this sort of matching. But the combination of the two, I think, makes something that's incredibly powerful.
Great, thank you. So it's, I guess, an amalgamation of a couple of people's questions, but there's a view that sometimes people's social media activity and their digital footprint doesn't necessarily reflect their true selves. So maybe they're a bit more cautious online. They have maybe a personal social profile that's very, very different from their work profile. So how does your technology sort of take account of that?
Yeah, and I think, like all these things that you can, either create a different persona and you can separate out. But the point about a digital footprint is that it's collecting it from many different sources. So you can have a different social media profile if you want, but your browsing history, your purchasing history, the time that you spend looking at Amazon for things, the time that you spend in Google looking at things, the time that you might spend on YouTube looking at things, and what you click on, what you don't click on, they are going to be your digital footprint. And I think this what it comes back to is that we tend to look and isolate and just say, oh, but my Facebook page, I have a public Facebook page and then I have a private Facebook page, and the two are different. If it was just one source of information, then you could differentiate that. But the point about digital psychometrics is it's looking at your entire digital footprint on this, and the predictive results from it are absolutely incredible. And if anybody is thinking about this, go and look at the Netflix program, The Social Dilemma, which will give you some incredible insights as to what the social media companies, and we think it's just limited to social media, but Uber and Just Eat and Deliveroo are all, looking at these, the way that you interact with their applications to understand you better and provide information that nudges your behaviour in a particular way.
Great, thank you. So we've got a really interesting question here from Stephen. It's saying, do you have a view on AI-driven counselling or coaching? So where there's an interaction directly between human and computer.
I think this is really, really interesting. And this comes back to how neuroscience is starting to work with technology to improve things. There's a company that I think is just listed called Kooth, who has been delivering cognitive behavior therapy online to support people with cognitive challenges or impairment. And I think there is a lot of opportunity for that, to really support that. Now, for me, it still comes back to how can you still bring in a human element and a human piece of subject matter expertise. So rather than, well, does just an AI-driven approach to looking at well-being, for example, deliver the service? It can do, but what are the insights that you can then get from that a subject matter expert can then use to support that individual?
Great. Okay, so I'm just looking at the time now, Robert. So it's been a really fascinating insight and a real privilege to have you today. And I hope that people have found that it's given them real food for thought. The great news is that you're staying on for the networking session, which is coming up next. And my understanding is that the link will be put into the chat along with a code that you can use. So again, we will, if you're comfortable for that, then we will continue to ask some additional questions of you. We've got some waiting for you, and we'll ask those. But I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to say to people before we leave to go into the networking session.
Not at all. Thank you. I just want to thank everybody for attending and listening in. I want to thank the ABP for giving me this opportunity. Thank also the sponsors as well for funding this, because these are the kind of sessions where we learn about things and we challenge ourselves. And so I've really enjoyed having this opportunity, and thank everybody for setting it up, and look forward to continuing the discussion.